Dr. Elias Morgan had always believed that distance from the world was the only way to heal, and there was no better place to escape than the infinite expanse of Antarctica. The cold here was relentless, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had settled deep within him. The howling wind tore at his layers, but it was a comfort of sorts. The sting of the cold was almost preferable to the sting of his memories. He adjusted his heavy gloves and scanned the horizon. It was just more snow, more ice, an endless, monotonous sea of white. No landmarks, no people, no distractions. Just the silence that had come to define his life. Elias had always been a scientist, drawn to the harshest and most unforgiving places on Earth. But this place wasn't just a professional interest. It had become a refuge. Here, he didn't have to deal with the world, and most importantly, he didn't have to confront the grief that still haunted him. He had come to Antarctica after losing everything: his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter, Emma. The accident was a blur in his memory, a haze of lights and sirens. One moment, they were there, laughing together, planning their future. The next, they were gone, and all that remained was a void too vast to comprehend. The doctors had called it a freak accident, but it felt like something far more sinister. The randomness of it, the cruelty of it, it shattered him in ways he wasn't sure he could ever repair. The emptiness of Antarctica mirrored his own. In the beginning, he'd been drawn to its raw, untouched beauty, its silence. There was no one here to remind him of what he'd lost. No well-meaning friends or concerned family. No one asking him when he would be ready to move on. He didn't have to pretend. He could just be. And so he'd come, leaving behind the wreckage of his past to seek solace in the frozen world. But now, as he trudged across the ice, a strange sensation gnawed at him. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't name, something unsettling in the stillness, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this frozen wilderness wasn't the escape he thought it would be. His breath came out in small puffs, each one dissipating into the frigid air. He pulled his jacket tighter around his chest, the cold biting at his face, and tried to focus on the task at hand. His research, gathering data on the region's ice shifts, was supposed to be his purpose. But lately, even that had started to feel like an exercise in futility. Elias looked down at his boots crunching against the snow, his footsteps leaving fleeting impressions on the surface. He had grown used to the solitude here, but there were days when the silence felt oppressive. The wind screamed around him, yet he felt a weight pressing down on him, heavier than the cold, as though the air itself was thick with something he couldn't quite grasp. The isolation wasn't as comforting as it had been when he first arrived. It was as though the world itself was closing in on him, reminding him that no matter how far he ran, he couldn't outrun the pain. A wave of fatigue hit him, and he stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath and glancing around. There was nothing, just more ice, more snow, stretching endlessly in all directions. His camp, a small cluster of tents and equipment, lay a few kilometers behind. The research station, a few days' journey ahead. In between, just this, the desolate beauty of the land, untouched by time, yet seemingly indifferent to his presence. Elias shifted his pack and adjusted the straps of his heavy coat, his movements mechanical. He was used to the weight of everything, the gear, the solitude, the grief, but today it felt different. It wasn't just the weight of his equipment. It was something else, something deeper. For the first time, he realized he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exhaustion of the journey. His soul was weary. He squinted against the wind, trying to focus on the data he needed to gather. But his thoughts kept drifting. He thought of Sarah, of Emma, of their lives together before the accident. There had been laughter in their house, warmth, and light. He used to wake up to the sound of Emma's tiny feet running through the house, her voice calling out to him. He could still hear her sometimes, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the howls of the wind. It was as though a part of him was still reaching for them, still hoping they would return. But they wouldn't, and that truth hung over him, like the heavy, unyielding ice beneath his feet. Elias had convinced himself that coming here, to this inhospitable place, would allow him to find some semblance of peace. He had hoped that the emptiness of Antarctica would be the balm he needed, a place where he could push everything away and just breathe. But instead, the emptiness only magnified the hollowness inside him. The vast, unbroken white landscape was a mirror of the void he had been living with for years. The longer he stayed, the more he realized that running away from his grief hadn't helped. It had only made it worse. And so, Elias continued his trek, step by step, across the frozen expanse, hoping for something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no escape, no place far enough, no distance long enough to outrun the past. The wind had picked up by the following morning, howling across the vast expanse like a living thing, tugging at Elias's clothes as he adjusted his parka. He had been walking for hours, following his usual route, mechanically checking his equipment, when something caught his eye. It was just a small flicker, a dark shape against the white ice, barely noticeable. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, but then it moved. He stopped, squinting, trying to make sense of the anomaly. In the distance, a lone figure waddled toward him. He couldn't believe it. Was it really a penguin? The sight was so out of place that his mind struggled to comprehend it. Penguins didn't live this far south, not in the depths of Antarctica's inhospitable wilderness. It made no sense. He had seen them in documentaries, waddling along the icy shores of more temperate Antarctic zones. But here, alone, without the rest of a colony, the bird drew closer, and Elias's heart gave a strange jolt. The penguin wasn't skittering, as he would have expected from an animal unsure of its surroundings. Instead, it walked with a purpose, its small feet cutting through the snow with surprising confidence. It didn't appear to be lost or confused. It seemed to be heading directly toward him, unfazed by the freezing winds, unbothered by the isolation. Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was no coincidence. He watched it with growing curiosity, unable to tear his eyes away. The penguin's sleek black and white feathers contrasted sharply against the pale landscape. Its eyes locked on him as though it recognized him, or perhaps was waiting for him. The absurdity of the situation settled into his chest, and he shook his head, almost laughing at himself. Of course, a penguin, in the middle of nowhere. It was ridiculous. Yet there was something oddly captivating about the way it moved, so deliberate, so persistent. The penguin halted a few feet away from him, cocking its head slightly, still watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. Elias stood still, his breath shallow as the wind whipped past them. He knew he should be doing something, taking notes, tracking the animal, or simply continuing on his journey. But something about this moment felt different, out of place in a way that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. He cleared his throat. "What's your story, little guy?" he muttered under his breath, though he knew the bird couldn't answer. He wasn't expecting it to, of course, but there was something almost comforting in the absurdity of the situation. A small, living thing in the midst of such desolation, something so utterly out of place in this frozen wasteland. Elias took a cautious step forward, trying to gauge the penguin's reaction. It didn't retreat, didn't flinch. Instead, it moved toward him, its short legs paddling through the snow with determination, keeping close as if it had decided to accompany him. He halted again, unsure how to react. Should he leave it behind? Should he continue? He could feel the weight of the cold pushing him forward, urging him to press on. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave the penguin alone. For the first time since he arrived in Antarctica, Elias felt something stir inside him, a flicker of recognition. There was no rational explanation for why this penguin was here, or why it had chosen to follow him, but there was something human in the way it sought his presence. There was no fear in the penguin's eyes, no hesitation. It simply existed in that moment, a part of this strange, foreign world. Elias, on the other hand, was anything but at peace. His heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort, the gnawing feeling that this encounter, this inexplicable event, was more than just an oddity in the landscape. There was something about the penguin's behavior that seemed intentional. Something in its unblinking gaze unsettled him, almost like it was studying him, waiting for something. The penguin's silence, the steadiness of its movements, seemed to speak louder, than any words could. He shook his head again, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't. But the longer the penguin stayed by his side, the less he wanted to leave. A part of him felt inexplicably tethered to this bird, as though it had a reason to be there, as though it needed him just as much as he needed it. And yet, the logical part of his mind screamed at him to move on, to stop entertaining this ridiculous idea that the penguin had some deeper purpose. "Get a grip, Elias," he muttered, adjusting his gear and turning to continue on his route. But the penguin didn't follow immediately. Instead, it stood there for a long moment, as though evaluating him, before it waddled after him again, its tiny feet making soft, almost indiscernible sounds against the ice. Elias didn't know why he didn't push the bird away, why he didn't just leave it behind and get back to work. Something about its silent company felt like a small reprieve from the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He didn't have anyone else to talk to. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, aside from the occasional radio transmission with the base, and even those were brief and clinical. But this penguin, this unexpected, strange creature, was here, and it seemed to want to stay. And somehow, Elias wasn't ready to let it go, even though everything about this moment screamed that he should. As he continued his trek, the penguin stayed by his side. It wasn't walking in front of him like a lost animal. It was walking with him, matching his pace, as though it had decided to be his companion for this journey, and nothing would change that. The cold continued to press in, the wind howling around them both. But in that moment, Elias realized something that took him by surprise. He wasn't alone. As the hours passed, Elias continued his trek across the frozen landscape, the penguin keeping pace beside him like an odd, silent shadow. It moved with a sense of purpose that Elias couldn't quite understand, and every time he glanced down, its unblinking eyes seemed to fixate on him with an almost knowing intensity. The cold had sunk deep into his bones, but it was the penguin's presence that kept him from feeling completely consumed by the isolation of the place. It was an absurd comfort, but Elias was no longer questioning it. He simply accepted it, as strange and illogical as it seemed. The penguin's pace was steady, its movements calculated. When Elias paused to adjust his pack or check his equipment, the bird stopped as well, standing a few feet away, staring at him with an unwavering gaze. At times, it seemed almost as though the penguin was watching for something, as if waiting for a signal, waiting for him to do something. Elias felt an inexplicable connection to the creature, as though they shared some unspoken understanding. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in omens or signs, but something about this moment felt far more significant than mere coincidence. He shifted his attention back to the trail ahead, trying to focus on the task at hand. The wind had died down for a brief moment, and the quiet felt almost oppressive. The world stretched out before him in endless white, as if he were walking across a blank canvas. His thoughts returned to Sarah and Emma. He hadn't been able to banish them from his mind since arriving, but today, the pain of remembering felt sharper than it had in weeks. He had tried to keep himself occupied, tried to immerse himself in his research, but grief had a way of creeping in when you least expected it. And in this vast, empty expanse, there was nowhere to hide from it. The penguin, however, remained by his side, as constant as the wind and the ice. The longer Elias walked with it, the more surreal the experience became. He was used to solitude, but this was different. He didn't feel the oppressive loneliness he had grown accustomed to. Somehow, having the penguin beside him alleviated some of the weight he'd been carrying. Just a little. He couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but it was there, a quiet sense of calm in the midst of his turmoil. "Where do you even come from?" Elias muttered to himself, half smiling as he glanced down at the bird. The penguin responded by tilting its head, as if considering the question. It was a ridiculous thought, and yet Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the penguin had more to do with his journey than mere coincidence. In the past, Elias had prided himself on his rationality. As a scientist, he believed in facts, in reason, in what could be observed and measured. But here, in the frozen wasteland, where logic didn't always apply, he found himself questioning everything. For a fleeting moment, Elias thought of the penguin as a reflection of his own state of mind. Lost, alone, searching for something he couldn't name. He had come to Antarctica to escape the past, to find solace in isolation. But now he wondered if his journey was less about running away and more about trying to find something to fill the void left by his loss. The penguin, in its odd, silent way, was offering him a kind of companionship he hadn't realized he needed. It didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything. It simply existed, and in that quiet existence, there was a strange kind of comfort. The penguin waddled closer to him, its small feet leaving footprints in the snow. Elias's heart twisted slightly as he observed the bird's graceful movements, the way it navigated the ice with a certainty that he could never seem to muster. He wanted to reach out, to touch it, to somehow anchor himself to this strange moment, but he hesitated. What did it mean? What did it all mean? He took another step forward, and the penguin followed, matching his pace without a word, without a sound. The landscape seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Elias found himself lost in the repetition of their steps, the endless whiteness surrounding them. A part of him wanted to believe that the penguin was leading him somewhere, that it had a purpose in guiding him through this desolate landscape. But what could it possibly want with him? What could a creature so far from its natural home be trying to convey? Elias stopped again, exhaustion creeping into his bones. His breath was heavy, his steps slower now, each one more difficult than the last. He was cold, so cold, and yet, in this vast, silent wilderness, with the penguin by his side, he felt a strange pull, a need to keep moving forward, to keep walking. There was something in the penguin's quiet company that soothed the sharp edges of his grief, a silent presence that allowed him to face the weight of his memories without succumbing to them. The penguin paused when Elias did, a small gap forming between them. It stood still, staring up at him, and for a moment, Elias couldn't look away. He felt like the bird was waiting for him to make the next move, to take the next step, and with that realization, Elias understood something fundamental. It wasn't the penguin that needed him. It was he who needed the penguin, not for the creature's presence, but for the quiet strength it embodied, the resilience, the ability to keep moving forward despite everything. With a deep breath, Elias nodded, more to himself than to the bird. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. "Let's keep going." And so they did, the penguin waddling beside him, its small form a constant reminder that even in the most isolated and desolate places, there was still a way forward, even if it meant walking alone, together. The day wore on, and the wind seemed to pick up again, howling relentlessly, as though trying to drive Elias back. The cold was biting, and the landscape appeared unchanged, vast, empty, endless. The monotony of it had settled into Elias's bones, a weight he couldn't shake, yet somehow, with the penguin at his side, it felt different. The feeling of companionship, however brief, had become something of an anchor in his turbulent mind. The penguin had stayed near, never faltering in its pace, its tiny feet leaving identical footprints next to his own. It moved with unerring certainty, its path as straight and purposeful as his. Elias, on the other hand, felt unmoored. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as though the world around him was pressing in, forcing him to confront things he'd rather not face. Every time he glanced down at the bird, he felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. The penguin, so at ease, seemed so certain, so confident in its purpose. He couldn't help but feel envious of that unwavering determination. He stopped again, this time to take a longer break. His legs were stiff, and the icy wind made it difficult to catch his breath. His hands were numb despite the layers of gloves, his face raw from the cold. There was no escape from it. Not here, not now. The cold was pervasive, an inescapable part of this place. He leaned against a jagged ice formation, breathing deeply, trying to calm the pounding of his chest. The weight of it all, the isolation, the grief, the constant reminder of everything he had lost, felt suffocating in that moment. The penguin, as it had done countless times before, stopped a few paces away from him. But this time, it did something different. Instead of standing still, it took a few hesitant steps toward Elias. Its small, awkward waddle slow but purposeful. It was as if it were trying to understand something about him, something unspoken. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The penguin's presence, so constant, so near, felt less like a coincidence with each passing hour. For a long while, neither of them moved. Elias, caught in the quiet, realized how desperately he had been trying to escape the turmoil inside him. Even here, in the most remote corner of the world, he couldn't outrun it. The grief, the questions, the uncertainty of life without his family, they followed him wherever he went. There had been days, weeks even, when he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, isolating himself, removing himself from the world. But now, with the penguin by his side, Elias wasn't so sure. Was it really the solitude he needed? Or was it something else entirely? Was he running from his past, or running towards something, some sense of resolution? The penguin took another step closer, and this time, Elias didn't move. He simply watched, his breath coming in slow, measured intervals. The animal's small body was steadfast against the wind, unfazed by the harshness of their environment. It wasn't waiting for him to do anything. It wasn't asking for anything. It was simply being. Elias found something profoundly peaceful in that. In the penguin's quiet insistence to be present, to stand firm in the face of such immense adversity. In a soft voice, barely audible over the howling winds, Elias spoke to the bird. "You don't need to be here, do you?" he murmured. "You don't need to wait for me. You don't need anything from me. But here you are, just walking with me." He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the complexity of the moment. He had tried so hard to escape the grief that had gripped him, tried to silence the pain that echoed in his heart. But it was there, always lurking just beneath the surface. No matter how far he walked, how much distance he put between himself and the life he once had, it always came back. But the penguin, this silent companion, had somehow given him something else. It had given him a moment of peace, a strange kind of understanding. The bird didn't judge, didn't question, didn't push. It simply existed in the same space as him. And in that shared silence, Elias realized something vital. Grief wasn't something to escape. It wasn't something to outrun. It was something to walk through, step by step, even in the most desolate places. The penguin's gaze softened, if such a thing was possible. Elias had no idea how he knew it, but he felt the animal was aware of his inner turmoil, aware of his pain. It was as though the bird, in all its quiet grace, was offering him something he hadn't allowed himself in years: acceptance. The acceptance to grieve, to feel, to heal in whatever way he could. The weight in Elias's chest loosened, just a little. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the cold air, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't entirely sure what the next step was. He didn't know how he would make peace with the past, or if he ever would. But somehow, in the penguin's steadfast presence, he had found the courage to keep walking forward. As if acknowledging Elias's decision, the penguin tilted its head and then continued its slow, deliberate walk ahead. Elias watched for a moment, then, without thinking, fell in step behind it, matching its pace. The frozen wasteland stretched out before them, an unyielding white desert. And yet, Elias no longer felt lost. He was no longer alone. They walked together, side by side, the penguin's quiet steps echoing his own as the wind began to settle around them. There was no destination, no clear path, but Elias understood something now. The journey wasn't about reaching the end. It was about moving forward, one step at a time. The landscape seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of white and ice. And yet, Elias felt as though time had slowed. With each step he took, his awareness of the penguin beside him deepened. They walked without speaking, without needing to. There was something comforting in the stillness, a quiet that permeated the space between them, allowing Elias to focus inward. The wind had died down again, leaving only the faint, rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the snow. The absence of sound felt almost sacred, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Elias was used to isolation, but this was different. In his earlier days of solitude, he had sought escape, an escape from memories, from pain, from a past that had left him broken. He had imagined that distance, both physical and emotional, would provide the healing he so desperately needed. But now, as the penguin silently walked beside him, Elias began to wonder if the real answer wasn't in running away, but in being present, in accepting where he was, with all of his wounds and uncertainties, and simply moving forward. The penguin, with its small, determined steps, seemed to embody this philosophy. It didn't resist the harsh winds or the cold. It didn't question its journey. It simply existed in the moment, one step at a time. It was a lesson in resilience, and Elias couldn't help but admire its unwavering focus. The penguin didn't seem to care about the obstacles in its path. It didn't seem to feel the crushing weight of isolation or fear the unknown. It was at peace with the journey. Elias, on the other hand, couldn't remember the last time he'd felt at peace with anything. Since Sarah and Emma had left, the world had felt like a constant storm, angry, unpredictable, and unforgiving. He had tried to outrun the chaos, to escape from the remnants of his old life. But now, in this stark, frozen world, he realized that running wasn't the answer. He had to face it. For the first time in years, Elias allowed himself to confront the quiet ache in his chest. The grief he had buried beneath layers of work, distractions, and travel was still there, and it was raw, more present than ever. It felt as though the ice beneath his boots was cracking, breaking open a part of him that had been sealed shut for too long. The penguin, ever by his side, never faltered. It was a steady reminder that life didn't pause for pain. It moved forward one step at a time, whether you were ready or not. His thoughts drifted back to Sarah, the way she had held him when they first met, how her eyes had softened when they talked about their future. He remembered the laughter they shared, their dreams of a family, and how everything had come crashing down when Emma was taken. It was as if the universe had ripped everything from him in one fell swoop, and in the aftermath, there had been nothing but silence. He had wandered through that silence, unsure of how to live without the love and the life he had known. But here, in the presence of this odd creature, this penguin, miles from home, lost in a place it had no business being, Elias began to see things differently. The bird was a reflection of the life he had left behind, the life where he once had dreams, hopes, and love. A life that had been swept away, not by a single event, but by a series of losses that had gradually eroded his sense of self. And yet, the penguin had somehow found its way to him, without reason, without question. It was like the universe had sent him a small, unexpected gift, a sign that even in the most desolate places, there could still be purpose. Elias let out a long, ragged breath. It was a struggle to keep moving forward. Every step felt like a battle against the cold, against the weight of his emotions, against the doubts that clouded his thoughts. But in that moment, as he walked beside the penguin, something shifted inside him. He didn't have to figure it all out. He didn't have to solve the mysteries of the world or the heartbreak that had shattered his life. All he had to do was keep going, keep walking. The penguin, who had been a few paces ahead of him, glanced over its shoulder and paused, as if to ensure that Elias was still with it. The moment of connection was brief but profound, and Elias felt a stirring of something deep inside him, a recognition that he wasn't truly alone. Even in this vast, unforgiving landscape, there was companionship. There was purpose. There was movement. Elias stopped and looked down at the penguin, his breath misting in the cold air. "You're right," he whispered to the bird, though he knew it couldn't understand. "It's not about where we're going, is it? It's about just continuing." The penguin made no sound, but it shifted slightly, as though acknowledging his words. Then, without hesitation, it continued on its path, its tiny steps steady and sure. Elias stood there for a moment longer, taking in the silence around him. It was as though the entire world had paused, giving him the space he needed to breathe, to think, to feel. The frozen wilderness was vast and infinite, yet it didn't feel so cold anymore. The penguin's presence, so simple and pure, had made him realize that the journey wasn't about avoiding the pain or searching for something that wasn't there. It was about moving forward, even in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of loss. With a final glance at the penguin, Elias took a deep breath and began walking again, his pace steady now as he followed the small bird across the frozen expanse. The landscape around him hadn't changed, but something within him had. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him or how long it would last, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, an understanding that the only way through the pain was to walk through it, step by step. The days seemed to blur together, the cold air biting, the endless expanse of snow unchanging. Elias had lost track of time. How long had he been walking now? Hours, days, maybe longer. The landscape had become an indistinguishable, frozen world, and yet, with each step, he felt something shift within himself. He could feel the penguin's steady presence beside him, its small feet crunching in the snow as it moved in sync with him, as though it too was traveling towards something, even if it didn't understand where. Elias hadn't asked himself why the penguin had appeared or why it hadn't left. The question seemed irrelevant now. In the early days, he had been desperate to understand the purpose of this strange companionship. But now, it was enough to simply accept it, to accept the silence, the walking, the companionship without the need for answers. It was the most profound lesson he had learned in years, that not everything had to be explained, that some things were meant to be felt, not understood. The penguin, so small and fragile compared to the overwhelming vastness of the ice, was a paradox. Its presence was an anchor in the storm of Elias's thoughts, offering him something beyond the cold. Despite the harsh environment, the penguin moved with purpose, unwavering, as though it had always known where it was going. For Elias, the animal became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that survival wasn't always about reaching a destination. It was about continuing forward, even when the path seemed endless. As they walked on, Elias couldn't help but reflect on how he had arrived here. His mind drifted back to the day when he had set out, not knowing where he was going, nor what he hoped to find. He had been running from his life, from the crushing weight of loss and grief, hoping that putting distance between himself and the past would somehow bring him peace. But now, after walking beside the penguin for so long, he realized that running had never been the answer. Peace wasn't something you could chase down. It was something that found you when you stopped looking for it. The penguin's steps continued to match his own, its small body moving forward with quiet determination. Elias had begun to see the bird in a new light, not as an oddity, nor a distraction from his grief, but as a companion, one that had shown him the power of stillness. The penguin didn't need to prove anything to him. It didn't ask for anything in return. It simply walked beside him, unbothered by the challenges that lay in front of them both. Elias stopped suddenly, overwhelmed by a sense of clarity. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been trying to outrun the grief, the pain of losing everything that had mattered. He had believed that if he put enough distance between himself and the past, the ache would eventually fade. But now, he understood that grief didn't work that way. It wasn't something that could be avoided or outrun. It was a part of him, an undeniable truth of his life. And the only way to move through it was to face it directly. There was no running anymore, no more trying to hide from the hurt. He looked down at the penguin, who had stopped a few paces ahead, waiting patiently for him to catch up. The bird didn't seem to be concerned with his internal struggle. It simply existed, walking through the cold, through the silence, without question. And in that moment, Elias realized that the penguin's strength lay in its ability to endure, to keep going without needing to understand why. Taking a deep breath, Elias began walking again, his steps more deliberate now, more conscious. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't trying to escape. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was simply moving through the pain. His thoughts no longer swirled in frantic circles. There was clarity now, clarity that he didn't need to have all the answers, that not every moment needed to make sense. What mattered was that he kept going one step at a time. The penguin turned and glanced up at him, as if to check if he was still following. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and Elias felt a strange, unspoken connection. He didn't need to ask the bird why it had stayed with him. The answer was already clear. The penguin had shown him that sometimes the only way forward was to keep walking. The journey wasn't about answers. It was about persistence, about moving forward even when the path ahead seemed endless and uncertain. As the day began to fade, the sky shifting into shades of violet and gray, Elias felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know how long he would keep walking or where this strange path with the penguin would take him. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The frozen world around him had become less of a threat and more of a companion, like the penguin who walked beside him. It was a reminder that in the stillness of life, there was always movement, always the possibility of moving forward, no matter how small the steps. With each passing moment, Elias understood more deeply that healing was not a destination. It wasn't a finality. It was a journey, one he could walk at his own pace, no matter how long it took. He wasn't alone anymore, and that for the first time was enough. Elias had long lost track of time. The days, marked only by the stark shifts in light, no longer mattered. His world had become a frozen expanse, and yet, it was in the solitude of that emptiness that he had found something unexpected peace. He had walked for so long with the penguin, the cold biting at his skin, the quiet stretching out like an endless canvas. And in that silence, something inside him had unraveled, and, for the first time in years, he felt the gentle stirring of hope. He had arrived at a place where he could no longer tell whether the penguin was leading him or if, in some strange way, he had started to lead the penguin. Their steps had fallen into sync, moving together across the vast whiteness of the world. The bird, once an enigma, had become something more, a companion, a mirror, a reminder of resilience. The penguin had no answers to offer, no wisdom beyond its simple, unyielding perseverance. And yet it was enough. Elias had stopped searching for a reason. He no longer wondered why the penguin had appeared in his life, why it had stayed by his side through every cold, desolate mile. He realized now that perhaps some things were never meant to be understood, only experienced. He didn't need to know the answer to why he was here or what his next step would be. What mattered was that he was still moving, still walking, still breathing in this unforgiving world. The frozen landscape had changed in his eyes. It was no longer an inhospitable wasteland, a reminder of everything he had lost. The ice, the snow, the vast empty space. They had become a reflection of something deeper, something he had buried beneath his grief and pain for far too long. The stillness of the world around him mirrored the stillness he had fought within himself. And just like the penguin, he had come to understand that sometimes, in order to heal, you had to sit with the silence, to embrace it, to move through it with no clear direction. The wind had died down once again, leaving only the soft sound of their footsteps on the snow. Elias looked down at the penguin, which had stopped a few paces ahead, its black and white feathers standing stark against the whiteness of the world. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, as if waiting for something. Elias's breath caught in his throat, a strange sense of finality washing over him. He had been walking for what felt like forever, and yet something was telling him that this moment, this stillness, was the answer he had been seeking. He reached down, almost instinctively, and gently stroked the back of the penguin's small head. The bird didn't flinch. It didn't shy away. It simply stood there, its body warm against the cold, its eyes reflecting the quiet intensity of the moment. There was no urgency, no sense of time, just a quiet understanding between them. "You don't have to walk anymore, do you?" Elias whispered, as if speaking to himself more than the penguin. The question seemed absurd, given the circumstances, but there was a deep sense of clarity in the air, a recognition that this was not about reaching a final destination, but about the journey itself. The penguin blinked slowly, then turned, resuming its steady walk, as if to remind Elias that there was always another step, always a new moment, even if it was unclear what lay ahead. Elias hesitated, watching the bird's small figure disappear into the distance, its tiny body making slow progress across the infinite whiteness. A part of him wanted to keep following, to stay tethered to this strange bond, but another part of him knew that he had reached the end of his own path. The realization hit him like a wave. He had already arrived. The destination he had been searching for had been within him the whole time. He had come to understand that the journey was not about finding a place, but about finding peace within himself, about accepting the stillness, the pain, the uncertainty. There was no need to keep running. Elias took a long, deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. The ache in his chest had not disappeared, but it no longer felt suffocating. It was just a part of him now, something he could carry without fear. He turned slowly, his legs weary, his mind clearer than it had been in years. The penguin was still there, distant now, its presence no longer a guiding force, but a quiet memory of the lessons learned along the way. Elias didn't need to follow it anymore. The penguin had shown him how to move forward, even in the face of uncertainty, how to accept the unknown without fear. With one final look at the bird, Elias turned back toward the horizon, toward the place where the land and sky merged into something undefined. There was no clear path ahead, no map, no guarantee of where he would go. But that was okay. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt at peace with the unknown. He was no longer running from the past or searching for answers. He was simply living one step at a time. As he walked into the distance, the penguin still visible in the farthest reaches of the frozen landscape, Elias knew this journey was his own. It was not a journey to be understood or explained. It was simply a journey that had to be lived. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.